Among the cases most frequently cited in Ian Stevenson's research, that of the twins Gillian and Jennifer Pollock from Hexham, England, became one of the classic examples included in his book 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, 1966. The study presents a sequence of clinical and behavioral observations that point to memories and personality traits seemingly transferred from two deceased children, the couple's older sisters, who had died in an accident a year before the twins' birth. The parents, John and Florence Pollock, belonged to the English middle class and lived a stable routine in the 1950s. The couple had two daughters, Joanna, born in 1946, and Jacqueline, born in 1951. On May 5, 1957, both were fatally hit by a car while walking to church, causing widespread local shock. The event was extensively reported by the regional press and police authorities. A few months later, Florence became pregnant again, and on October 4, 1958, two identical twin girls were born, which was unprecedented in the family. The father believed they were the return of his lost daughters, a hypothesis the mother initially rejected. This difference in conviction between the two would be relevant to the study, as it eliminated the possibility of conscious suggestion and offered Stevenson a behavioral control variable. From the first months of life, Jennifer displayed two birthmarks identical to Jacqueline's, a dark spot on her left flank and a thin scar on her forehead, corresponding to an old injury caused by a fall in childhood. The marks were photographed and included in the researchers' records. Between the ages of 2 and 3, the twins began to show spontaneous recognition of objects and places that had belonged to their deceased sisters. When presented with the stored toys, each precisely identified which one belonged to her. The division coincided with that of the dead girls. The parents assured Stevenson that they had never disclosed details about the previous sisters. In addition to the recognition reactions, Stevenson observed distinct behavioral patterns, identical to those described for Joanna and Jacqueline. Gillian showed initiative and a protective demeanor. Jennifer was more dependent and reserved. These traits were described by him as a transfer of personality role. An episode reported by the mother caught the researchers' attention. While crossing a street, the twins reacted with extreme fear to an approaching car, stating that the car was coming to get us. The family confirmed that the girls had no knowledge of the previous accident. These and other initial reports motivated the systematic investigation led by Ian Stevenson, who considered the Pollock case a rare study opportunity in a Western context, a culturally non-predisposed region to the idea of reincarnation, which gave the case special methodological value. In the initial surveys conducted by Ian Stevenson and his colleagues, the focus fell on the set of behaviors displayed by the twins between the ages of 2 and 5, the period when spontaneous memories are most vivid in the cases classified by the researcher as suggestive of reincarnation. Parental reports, confirmed by independent interviews, indicated that the girls reacted with familiarity to places and objects related to their deceased sisters. When presented with the old toys, Gillian chose exactly those that belonged to Joanna, and Jennifer kept the ones that had been Jacqueline's without prior instruction. The correspondence was recorded in a field notebook and corroborated by photographs taken at the family's home in Hexham. When traveling around the town, the twins pointed out locations they had never visited. They correctly identified Wickham School, where the previous daughters had studied, and a park that had been renovated after the accident. The mother confirmed that she had not shown photos or mentioned these places before. Stevenson classified these episodes as spontaneous recognition of a previous environment, a recurrent pattern in cases documented in Asia and very rare in the West. Another relevant element was the unconscious reproduction of social roles. From a very young age, Gillian demonstrated protective behavior toward her sister, taking the lead in activities and decisions, exactly as Joanna did with Jacqueline. Jennifer, in turn, exhibited a more insecure and dependent posture, consistent with the reported personality of her deceased sister. The researcher described the phenomenon as transfer of relational traits, in contrast to simple coincidences in temperament. During home observations, the twins exhibited intense emotional reactions to specific stimuli, particularly those related to cars. Stevenson noted that both showed marked fear when crossing streets, a behavior that did not fit the profile of children without prior traumatic experience. On one occasion, Jennifer reportedly told her mother, "The car is coming again." These statements were recorded before the age of 4. The verification methodology included separate interviews with neighbors, relatives, and teachers to rule out possible parental influences or suggestion. The testimonies showed temporal consistency. The manifestations appeared without prompting and spontaneously. Stevenson highlighted that the mother, Florence, maintained a skeptical attitude, which reduced the risk of contamination through family suggestion. The behavioral analysis also showed that the girls had a strong symbolic relationship with specific objects. A damaged toy car stored since the death of the previous daughters aroused unusual attention in Jennifer. She claimed to have crashed it and hurt her head, a phrase that corresponded to an episode recorded in the family diaries about Jacqueline. These behaviors were compiled by Stevenson as evidence of non-acquired memory continuity, observed in a neutral and culturally non-reincarnationist context. The researcher considered the Pollock case an example of high internal coherence, presenting the combination of 3 main factors: spontaneous memories, physical correspondence, and behavioral correspondence. At the end of this observation phase, Stevenson classified the case as worthy of detailed documentation and prepared the sequence of investigations, which would include verification of medical background, analysis of birthmarks, and control of external variables. After confirming the coherence of the initial reports, Ian Stevenson applied the same protocol used in his international investigations to the Pollock case. The method involves serial interviews, collection of official documents, comparison of photographic records, and consultation with local specialists for independent verification. The researcher structured the analysis around 4 axes: correspondence of personal identity, similarities in temperament, preferences, and emotional bonds between the twins and the deceased sisters, physical evidence, detailed analysis of Jennifer's birthmarks, and comparison with Jacqueline's scars. Environmental verification, spontaneous recognition of places and objects, normal sources of information, exclusion of indirect learning, parental induction, or genetic coincidence. During visits conducted between 1963 and 1966, Stevenson interviewed the parents separately, in addition to neighbors, teachers, and local doctors. The testimonies showed chronological consistency. The twins' manifestations began before they were 3 and occurred without stimulus or prior discussion about the dead daughters. Florence Pollock, a skeptic, avoided any reference to the deceased girls, which, for Stevenson, functioned as a natural control against suggestion. The researcher also recorded that the twins were monozygotic, eliminating the hypothesis that hereditary differences could explain the bodily marks and divergent behaviors. Stevenson pointed out that the absence of a genetic history of twins in the family reduced the probability of biological chance. The analysis of the birthmarks was conducted in collaboration with 2 British doctors. Jennifer had a pigmented spot on her left flank and a linear mark on her forehead, both coinciding in shape and position with those Jacqueline had before her death. Stevenson obtained photographs, compared them with old images, and attached the medical records to the report. The case was classified in the category with confirmed anatomical correlation. In addition to the physical evidence, Stevenson assessed the parents' psychological context. The father, John Pollock, believed in reincarnation, but the mother maintained firm disbelief. This opposition reduced the probability of family suggestion because even without maternal encouragement, the twins displayed behaviors consistent with those of the previous daughters. In field reports, Stevenson observed that the twins spontaneously reproduced complementary roles, Gillian as the protective figure and Jennifer as the more dependent one. This pattern corresponded to the documented descriptions of Joanna and Jacqueline before the accident. To validate the observations, Stevenson applied the cross-verification procedure, comparing statements obtained at different times. He recorded that the children's statements maintained coherence even when reproduced months later, and that the details of places and names cited coincided with information available only in the family archives. The cultural environment of Hexham was also considered. It is a traditional Christian community without the influence of reincarnation beliefs. Stevenson emphasized that the absence of cultural expectation reinforced the scientific value of the case. At the end of this stage, the researcher concluded that the set of data gathered, physical, behavioral, and contextual, showed a high degree of correlation, sufficient for inclusion in the work 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. The Pollock case came to represent for Stevenson a model for the scientific documentation of spontaneous memory phenomena in a non-Oriental environment. During the follow-up of the Pollock twins throughout their early childhood, Ian Stevenson focused his attention on the girls' cognitive and emotional development, seeking to understand whether the observed manifestations could be explained by processes of unconscious learning, family identification, or known mechanisms of early memory. Observations recorded between 1963 and 1966 showed that Gillian and Jennifer had vocabulary and spatial understanding slightly above average for their age group, as well as verbal expressions unusual for children aged 3 to 4. At various times, the girls used pronouns and phrases in the past tense when referring to activities they had not lived, such as "when we went to the big school" or "when we played near the gate." These statements were recorded spontaneously, without an inducing context. Stevenson verified that the content of these statements corresponded to places and situations associated with the deceased sisters. The big school was the same institution attended by Joanna and Jacqueline in Wickham. The gate mentioned referred to the exact point where the accident occurred in 1957. The coincidence between the reports and the historical facts was considered by Stevenson to be one of the heaviest pieces of evidence in the case, since the children had never visited or seen images of these places. The dynamic between the two twins also aroused clinical interest. Gillian, like Joanna, exhibited protective and assertive behavior, preferring to look after her sister. Jennifer maintained the pattern of dependence observed in Jacqueline, constantly asking for help and avoiding contact with strangers. Stevenson highlighted that this parallelism of family roles was reproduced with precision, even though the girls had no direct references to their previous sisters. The fear of cars persisted as a notable trait. During outings, both crossed streets with excessive caution, holding on to each other and showing anxiety in the face of moving vehicles. The researcher classified this behavior as a possible reflection of residual trauma, manifested unconsciously. He ruled out environmental causes, as the family lived in a quiet area with no history of recent accidents. From a medical perspective, there were no signs of psychological disorders, identity confusion, or any sign of hallucination. The manifestations were described as spontaneous behaviors in healthy children within normal developmental parameters. Stevenson also tracked the gradual disappearance of the memories. By around age 7, the twins stopped mentioning episodes from their previous lives, focusing on their current school and family routine. The researcher observed that this phenomenon followed the same pattern observed in other investigations, where spontaneous recollections emerge between ages 2 and 5 and dissipate as current autobiographical memory solidifies. The final report of this phase concluded that the manifestations of the Pollock twins showed internal coherence and were free from external explanatory factors. Stevenson described the case as an example of behavioral and physiological continuity that goes beyond the known field of developmental psychology, reinforcing the scientific value of the documentation. Jennifer Pollock's birthmarks became one of the central elements of the analysis conducted by Ian Stevenson, as they represented physical evidence that could be objectively examined. The researcher maintained the same rigor applied in other studied cases, photographically documenting every detail and requesting independent evaluations from British doctors. Jennifer had 2 distinct marks at birth, a small whitish line in the region of the right forehead and an oval pigmented spot on the left side of her body near the waist. Stevenson compared these marks with photographic records and medical reports of Jacqueline, the deceased sister. The anatomical correspondence between the two was considered exact. Jacqueline had suffered a fall at age 3 that left an identical scar on her forehead. Additionally, she had a dark congenital spot in the same location on her body. Photographs taken by Stevenson and local doctors showed a coincidence not only in location, but also in shape and size. The absence of a family history of similar marks reinforced the value of the observation. The researcher concluded that the anatomical correspondences could not be explained by genetic inheritance, since the twins were monozygotic and only Jennifer exhibited such characteristics. During the medical analysis, Dr. Harold Price, a clinician from Northumberland, was asked to verify the authenticity of the marks. The report confirmed they were true congenital formations and not postnatal scars. This document was included by Stevenson in the appendix of 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation. Based on this finding, the researcher related the Pollock case to other studies that presented similar patterns. In approximately 1/3 of the cases he had documented in different countries, the bodily marks coincided with injuries or physical characteristics of the deceased person associated with the previous personality. In Jennifer's case, the marks were not linked to the cause of death but to the bodily history of the previous sister, which, according to Stevenson, suggested continuity of non-traumatic traits. In addition to the marks, subtle differences in motor coordination were observed. Jennifer showed slight difficulty using her left hand, the same side Jacqueline had injured in a domestic accident. This motor correspondence was recorded as a correlate somatic manifestation, reinforcing the idea of a connection between physical patterns and previous experiences. The twins underwent general medical examinations, with no anomalies found besides the described marks. Stevenson considered these findings complementary to the behavioral evidence. For him, the presence of verifiable anatomical elements associated with spontaneous memories and specific personality traits represented a set of empirical data difficult to fit into conventional models of biology or child psychology. The final report of this stage concluded that the Pollock case belonged to the category of cases with anatomical and behavioral correlation of high consistency, an expression used by Stevenson to designate situations in which the set of evidence, physical, psychological, and environmental, was mutually reinforcing. This type of documentation became one of Stevenson's main contributions to reincarnation research, allowing studies on the subject to be analyzed by scientific parameters rather than just interpretive ones. In the case of the Pollock twins, the coherence between bodily marks, spontaneous memories, and personality profiles solidified the study as one of the most complete investigations in the entire series published by the University of Virginia. With the behavioral and physical documentation complete, Ian Stevenson dedicated himself to the methodological verification stage, the purpose of which was to eliminate alternative explanations and test the consistency of the data. This phase was conducted between 1966 and 1968 and involved repeated interviews with the parents, educators, and health professionals who accompanied the twins. The goal was to determine whether the reported behaviors could have originated from indirect learning, genetic coincidence, or emotional influence stemming from family grief. Stevenson adopted the cross-verification method, obtaining statements at different times and separating the interviews to prevent information contamination. John and Florence Pollock's statements were compared line by line. He observed that while the father firmly believed in reincarnation, the mother maintained a skeptical attitude and tried to avoid the topic. This divergence reduced the probability of conscious parental suggestion. Even so, the children's manifestations occurred both in the presence of the father and under the mother's supervision, with the same pattern of spontaneity. The researcher also analyzed the social environment. Hexham was a conservative Christian community, where the idea of reincarnation was not part of the local culture. Stevenson highlighted this data as an important cultural control, as the twins grew up in an environment that neither favored nor encouraged the type of discourse they presented. This reinforced the hypothesis that the reports did not come from external influence. Interviews with neighbors and teachers confirmed that the girls' differentiated behaviors were observable in contexts outside the family. In the classroom, Gillian took on a leadership role, while Jennifer showed insecurity and a tendency to seek protection, reproducing the same pattern as the deceased sisters. These independent testimonies were recorded in signed reports and attached to the main file. To rule out the possibility of indirect memory, where a child unconsciously absorbs external reports or information, Stevenson investigated narrative control within the home. Florence reported that she had kept all the deceased daughter's belongings until the twins were over 2 years old, and that she avoided conversations about the past in their presence. According to Stevenson, this made it unlikely that the children had obtained details about the objects and places they identified later. The researcher also reviewed the hypothesis of behavioral coincidence between monozygotic twins. Although it was common for identical twins to develop complementary characteristics, the correspondence between specific traits and memories of distinct people, Joanna and Jacqueline, could not be explained by genetics alone. Stevenson classified this characteristic as differential correspondence within identical twins, a phenomenon observed in other studies, but rarely to such a defined degree. The results of these verifications were submitted for review by academic colleagues at the University of Virginia and by external researchers, including psychologist J.G. Pratt, who praised the precision of the documentation and the control of contextual variables. Even though the phenomenon remained without a known causal explanation, the case was considered methodologically sound. Stevenson concluded this phase by stating that the Pollock case met conditions of high scientific reliability with observable data in 3 independent domains: physical, psychological, and testimonial, all converging on the same pattern of correspondence. The study then became part of the core group of cases published in 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation, and subsequently the series of internal reports of the Division of Personality Studies at the University of Virginia. From this point, the case ceased to be just a singular account and began to serve as a reference for the development of standardized research protocols. It demonstrated that, even in Western and culturally skeptical contexts, it was possible to apply rigorous scientific methodology to the study of spontaneous memories in childhood. After the publication of 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation in 1966, the Pollock case was widely discussed at conferences and in scientific journals focused on anomalous psychology and psychiatry. Among the scholars who reviewed the material were psychologist J.G. Pratt and British researcher Celia Green, both acknowledging the documentary consistency and the absence of satisfactory conventional explanations. The main limitation identified in the reviews was the impossibility of direct experimentation, a characteristic common to studies based on natural observation. Stevenson maintained periodic contact with the Pollock family in the following decades, seeking to verify whether the manifestations would persist throughout the twins' development. Follow-up visits conducted in the early 1970s showed that the spontaneous memories had completely disappeared around the age of 7. This data was considered relevant as it corresponded to the pattern observed in other cases: the gradual fading of recollections as the autobiographical memory of the present life solidifies. During adolescence, Gillian and Jennifer displayed typical cognitive and emotional development, with no signs of dissociative disorders or identity-related issues. The mother, Florence Pollock, reported that her daughters lived normal lives and that the past was no longer a topic of conversation. Stevenson highlighted this point as an indication that the episodes of spontaneous memory did not have a pathological origin, reinforcing the hypothesis of a non-traumatic phenomenon. The follow-up also revealed the persistence of certain behavioral traits. Gillian maintained an assertive and outgoing personality, with characteristics similar to those described in Joanna, while Jennifer remained reserved and introspective, like Jacqueline. Although Stevenson did not assign conclusive value to this continuity, He recorded the data as evidence of the maintenance of temperament traits even after the disappearance of conscious memories. In the 1980s, researchers associated with the University of Virginia, including Icelandic psychologist Erlendur Haraldsson, reviewed the case as part of a methodological replication project. Haraldsson confirmed the internal consistency of the original observations and the absence of new anomalous manifestations in the twins' adulthood. In published reports, he classified the Pollock case as a closed record with sufficient data for definitive documentation. Over time, the case became a central reference in discussions about methodology applied to reincarnation research in Western contexts. Even among critics who rejected the reincarnation hypothesis, there was recognition that the study represented a model of rigorous and impartial documentation. The British psychologist Robert Almeida, for example, used the case in debates about scientific epistemology, arguing that the level of empirical evidence presented was incompatible with simple chance. In the 1990s, Stevenson again included the Pollock case in his work Reincarnation and Biology, 1997, where he presented a comparative analysis between birthmarks and spontaneous memories in hundreds of children studied in different countries. In this work, the Pollock case was described as a Western example of high documentary integrity, standing out for having been collected in an environment free of reincarnationist cultural influence. For almost 4 decades, continuous follow-up and independent reviews did not identify significant flaws in the original information. The conclusions remained unchanged. The case presented physical and behavioral correspondence between 2 generations of children under conditions that ruled out known explanations. These findings led Stevenson to propose the concept of psychobiological continuity, according to which certain aspects of personality and bodily structure could transcend traditional biological individuality. Although he acknowledged that the underlying mechanism remained unexplained, Stevenson maintained that the consistency of the data justified the inclusion of the phenomenon in the field of legitimate scientific investigation. With the conclusion of field observations and the consolidation of independent reports, the Pollock case came to occupy a prominent position among Ian Stevenson's studies. Until his death in 2007, the researcher always cited it as a paradigm example of empirical coherence in a Western context, a case in which spontaneous memories, anatomical marks, and psychological profiles showed a significant correlation, free from cultural interference. In the Division of Personality Studies at the University of Virginia, the case was classified as belonging to the category of high documentary reliability, forming the core of evidence used for statistical and methodological analysis in subsequent research. Stevenson emphasized that the merit of the study did not lie in proving reincarnation, but in demonstrating that the phenomenon of spontaneous memories could be observed, described, and verified by scientific criteria. Starting in 1998 with the founding of the Division of Perceptual Studies, DOPS, the original file of the Pollock case was preserved in full format, including photographs, testimonies, correspondence, and medical reports. Researchers such as Jim B. Tucker and Erlendur Haraldsson used the material in comparative analyses and kept the case as a reference for new studies on identity and consciousness. The impact of the case extended beyond the field of parapsychology, reaching developmental psychology and transcultural psychiatry. Studies on early memory and childhood trauma began to consider the Pollock case as an example of a non-pathological manifestation of detailed memories of unlived events. This methodological transition from the anecdotal to the clinical was one of Stevenson's main contributions to the scientific treatment of the topic. In his final publications, Stevenson reinforced that the value of cases like the Pollock twins lay in systematic documentation and a willingness to treat unusual phenomena with scientific neutrality. For him, denying the observation of consistent data simply because it contradicted existing paradigms would be incompatible with the scientific method. The researcher wrote, "The task of the scientist is to report what occurs, even when he does not understand the mechanism that produces it. Stevenson's ethical stance was also notable. For decades, he avoided any sensational exposure, preserving the twins' privacy and treating the Pollock family with rigor and respect. This care solidified the case as a reference for good practices in field research involving anomalous psychological phenomena. As the years passed, the Pollock case continued to be re-examined, not as definitive proof of reincarnation, but as a clinical record of the continuity of personal traits across generations, still without a satisfactory explanation within traditional biology and psychology. Today, more than half a century after the birth of Gillian and Jennifer, the study remains cited in academic conferences and publications on consciousness and identity. The body of evidence gathered by Stevenson, physical marks, behavioral parallels, and spontaneous memories, continues to challenge restrictive models of the human mind. The Pollock case concludes as an example of rigor, sobriety, and scientific persistence in the face of a phenomenon that transcends cultural boundaries and questions the modern understanding of the continuity of consciousness. By treating it with the precision of a clinician and the prudence of an investigator, Ian Stevenson left a lasting legacy, the possibility of examining the extraordinary without abandoning the scientific method.